Oscar Wilde. Just on the floor, like a wounded thing, it says here. Dorian hides the portrait. Influence over. Hi there, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, a warm welcome to you as well. If you enjoy bookish ASMR content, I would love for you to subscribe. Also, please say hello in the comments. I absolutely love to receive comments, and I so appreciate all the nice comments that I receive. Tonight, I am going to talk about one of my favorite novels, The Picture of Dorian Gray. This is my copy, which is heavily annotated and flagged, as you can see. I will also refer to this library book that I borrowed, and it's called The Picture of Dorian Gray, an annotated, uncensored edition. And the annotations in here are numerous, and it is heavily illustrated. So I will be happy to show you some of those illustrations and photographs along the way. I'm going to highlight important plot points of the novel and then look at themes and motifs, and also talk about the book's reception, its lasting significance today, including its adaptation to film and modern book retellings. So I'm just going to open up here to the page that I got started for us in this journal, where I keep all my notes for these soft studies that we do here. The Picture of Dorian Gray was written by Oscar Wilde, and I printed off these two photographs of Oscar Wilde. This is another one. Oscar Wilde was born on October 16th, 1854. And he was born in Dublin, Ireland. He lived until November 30th, 1800. So I've written those facts down right here. When he was born and when he died. The novel was first published in 1890 in Lippincott's monthly magazine. You can see here. This number contains The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Complete July 1890, it says right here. In terms of genre, this is a work of Gothic horror, and it's also considered philosophical fiction. Philosophical fiction. The novel begins in the luxurious home of an artist called Basil Hallwood. So here we have chapter 1, and I do have a map I'd like to show you that shows London at the time. So here's the map. It says down here, London in Wilde's day. And there's a quote here. This grey, monstrous London of ours, proclaimed Dorian Gray, with its myriads of people, its splendid sinners, and its sordid scenes, must have something in store for me. It's really fun to examine this map. So, if you can get a copy of this book, I highly recommend it. So, as I was saying, the novel begins in the luxurious London home of an artist called Basil Hallwood, where he and his friend Lord Henry Wotton discuss the subject of Basil's most recent painting, a portrait of a beautiful young man. Lord Henry Wotton urges Basil to send it out and exhibit it as he believes it to be Basil's best work. Basil admits that he cannot send it out into the world, and I will read to you what he says. It says here, I know you will laugh at me, he replied, but I really can't exhibit it. I have put too much of myself into it. That's what he says to his friend, Lord Henry Wotton. So, as they're discussing the painting, Basil accidentally shares the name of the beautiful man of the painting. And that name is Dorian Gray, the object of Basil's obsession. And so I can read a little bit about that and show you what Basil says. It says, every day, I couldn't be happy if I didn't see him every day. He is absolutely necessary to me. He's talking about Dorian Gray of the portrait. And then over here, it says, he is all my art to me now. And then here, but he is much more than a model or a sitter. I won't tell you that I am dissatisfied with what I have done of him, or that his beauty is such that art cannot express it. There is nothing that art cannot express, and I know that the work I have done since I met Dorian is good work, is the best work of my life. And down here it says, Basil, this is extraordinary. I must see Dorian Gray. That's Lord Henry, his friend. So, I have a picture, an illustration in this book that I want to show you from that scene. Here it is, right here. So this is the scene that I just described, the two men. And it says here, Dorian Gray. Is that his name? And this is from, it says, by S.A. Moss to the Picture of Dorian Gray, Volume 2 of the Sunflower edition of the works of Oscar Wilde, New York, 1909. So toward the end of the first chapter, the discussion between Basil the artist and Lord Henry, his friend, is interrupted by a butler who announces that Dorian Gray has arrived. And that's coming in right about here at the end of chapter 1. And this picture here, page 66, I believe. Yeah. So here they are, Lord Henry admiring the painting. And it says here, it is your best work, Basil. It is your best work, Basil. And this is wood engraved illustration, frontispiece to the Picture of Dorian Gray, Paris, Charles Carrington, 1908, 1910. So in chapter 2, just begins here, and again to illustrate the beginning of this scene again, let's look at page 91. Dorian Gray. It says, front piece to the Picture of Dorian Gray intro, Osbert Burdett. Illustrator, Henry Keane, London and New York, 1925. So we can imagine what Dorian Gray looked like. Let's put this like this for a minute. And talk about what happens in chapter 2. So, it's chapter 2. While Basil paints a portrait of Dorian Gray, Lord Henry reveals his hedonistic beliefs to the young, impressionable Dorian. So I will read a little bit about that here. The aim of life is self-development, to realize one's nature perfectly. That is what each of us is here for. People are afraid of themselves nowadays. They have forgotten the highest of all duties, the duty that one owes to one's self. So that's Lord Henry speaking. And it's the beginning of a long relationship of influence that Lord Henry has over Dorian. And let's see over here as well, some more of that. You, Mr. Gray. So this is Henry speaking to Dorian that he just met, the young, beautiful man. You, Mr. Gray, you have yourself with your rose-red lips and your rose-white boyhood. You have had passions that have made you afraid, thoughts that have filled you with terror, daydreams and sleeping dreams whose mere memory might stain your cheek with shame. Dorian asks to get some air outside as it's quite stuffy inside. And so he and Lord Henry go out to the garden while Basil remains behind to do some detail work on the painting of Dorian. Outside, Lord Henry vehemently advises Dorian to live life fully now, since beauty fades with time, as does youth, and that beauty and youth are everything. So I'll read a little bit of what Lord Henry Wotton says to Dorian Gray outside in the garden. You have a wonderfully beautiful face, Mr. Gray. Don't frown. And beauty is a form of genius, is higher indeed than genius, as it needs no explanation. It is of the great facts of the world, like sunlight or springtime or the reflection in dark waters of that silver shell we call the moon. It cannot be questioned. It has its divine right of sovereignty. It makes princes of those who have it. And then down here it says, time is jealous of you and wars against your lilies and your roses. You will become sallow and hollow-cheeked and dull-eyed. You will suffer horribly. Ah, realize your youth while you have it. Don't squander the gold of your days listening to the tedious trying to improve the hopeless failure, or give away your life to the ignorant, the common, or the vulgar. And over here, the pulse of joy that beats in us at 20 becomes sluggish. our limbs fail, our senses rot, we degenerate into hideous puppets haunted by the memory of the passions of which we were too much afraid, and the exquisite temptations that we had not the courage to yield to. Youth, youth, there is absolutely nothing in the world but youth. So this is the early influence that Lord Henry Wotton is having on Dorian Gray when he is young and innocent and vulnerable to this type of influence. So, the beautiful, young, and impressionable Dorian is mesmerized by all that Lord Henry shares with him outside. Basil calls the two inside again so that he can continue painting with his model in sight. Inside, Basil completes the painting. Lord Henry congratulates Basil on his work and says, "It is the finest portrait of modern times," and then calls Dorian over to take a look. So I will read that exchange now, which is on page 27 here. Okay, up here it says, When he saw it, he drew back, and his cheeks flushed for a moment with pleasure. A look of joy came into his eyes, as if he had recognized himself for the first time. So that's Dorian looking at the portrait that Basil has painted of him for the first time. I continue here. He stood there, motionless and in wonder, dimly conscious that Hallward was speaking to him, but not catching the meaning of his words. The sense of his own beauty came on him like a revelation. He had never felt it before. Basil Hallward's compliments had seemed to him to be merely the charming exaggerations of friendship. And down here it says, yes, there would be a day when his face would be wrinkled and wizen, his eyes dim and colorless, the grace of his figure broken and deformed. The scarlet would pass away from his lips, and the gold steal from his hair. The life that was to make his soul would mar his body. He would become dreadful, hideous, and uncouth. And down here it says, how sad it is, murmured Dorian Gray, with his eyes still fixed upon his own portrait. How sad it is. I shall grow old and horrible. So, and dreadful, it says here. If it were only the other way, if it were I who was to be always young and the picture that was to grow old, for that I would give everything. Yes, there's nothing in the whole world I would not give. I would give my soul for that. So that is quite significant right there. And foreshadows what's to come. Basil says that he will give the painting to Dorian. Let's look at an illustration here that is relevant to this scene. So, here. It says, Dorian Gray by Basil Hallward, published as the front piece to the Picture of Dorian Gray. New York, Charterhouse Press, 1904. So that is what the artist who illustrated this book, published in 1904, imagined what Dorian looked like. So at the end of the chapter, Lord Henry invites Basil and Dorian to go to the theatre, but only Dorian accepts as Basil has more work to do. So the next chapter, chapter 3, at a little gathering hosted by Lord Henry's aunt, where the good-looking young man Dorian is also present, Lord Henry shocks the guests with his views on hedonism and self-indulgence in pleasure and immersing oneself in beauty, which went against the morality and philanthropy fashionable at the time. Although everyone is appalled by his views, they're kind of charmed by his delivery, the way he speaks. Dorian is especially enthralled with Lord Henry, and instead of going to visit the artist Basil, Dorian, changes his plan and heads out with Lord Henry instead. So a month passes, and we're headed into chapter 4 now. Dorian waits for Lord Henry in his home. And there's an illustration here that shows Dorian waiting. It's right here. Here he is in the home of Lord Henry. Dorian Gray is waiting for Lord Henry to return. And it says here, one afternoon, a month later, Dorian Gray was reclining in a luxurious armchair in the little library of Lord Henry's home in Mayfair. This is from the Picture of Dorian Gray, 1930 edition, published by Majeska, New York. So, when he arrives home, Dorian tells Lord Henry that he has fallen in love with a young woman named Sybil Vane. Sybil Vane, an actress that he discovered at a gaudy little theater in a grimy neighborhood. Dorian tells Lord Henry that despite the poor, pathetic quality of the cheap theater house, he believes Sybil to be an excellent actress, and that he has met her and fallen deeply in love with her and her beauty. So Lord Henry agrees to attend the theater with Dorian to see Sybil act for himself. Dorian also explains that he has received his portrait from Basil very recently. So that is what happens in chapter 4. Here we are now at chapter 5. In this chapter, it is a scene of Sybil and her family, where Sybil admits her love for Dorian to her mother, who's quite cautious about it. And yet, when she shares her news of love with her brother James, James is even more cautious than his mother. James warns Sybil about Dorian and shares his concerns with her, expressing that he will kill Sybil's Prince Charming. That's what she likes to call him, Prince Charming. James will kill Sybil's Prince Charming if he does any harm to her. So now we're at chapter 6 already. And this chapter begins with Lord Henry and Basil in a discussion during a dinner. Lord Henry shares the news with Basil of Dorian's plans to marry Sybil. And Dorian doesn't think it's a good idea, as the lovers are from very different classes. So Dorian arrives and expresses his love for Sybil, and the three men head out to the theater to watch Sybil perform. So in chapter 7 now, this is a scene where the men are in the theater and they watch Sybil perform in the play. And to Dorian's utter dismay, Sybil's acting is suddenly atrocious. Shocked and heartbroken, Dorian heads backstage alone to talk to Sybil. And here is a little from the conversation. It's here. It's up here somewhere. Dorian, Dorian, she cried. Before I knew you, acting was the one reality of my life. It was only in the theater that I lived. I thought that it was all true. I was Rosalind one night, and Portia the other. The joy of Beatrix was my joy, and the sorrows of Cordelia were mine also. I believed in everything. And down here it says, tonight, for the first time in my life, I saw through the hollowness, the sham, the silliness of the empty pageant in which I had always played. So this is Sybil talking to Dorian backstage, explaining herself to him. And she goes on to say, and that the words I had to speak were unreal. And that's the words of the characters she played. The words I had to speak were unreal, were not my words, were not what I wanted to say. You had brought me something higher. And down here, it says, take me away, Dorian, take me away with you, where we can be quite alone. I have the stage. I hate the stage. I might mimic a passion that I do not feel, but I cannot mimic one that burns like fire. Oh, Dorian, Dorian, you understand now what it signifies. He flung himself down on the sofa and turned away his face. You have killed my love, he muttered. Over here is a little bit more from this scene. Then he leaped up and went to the door. Yes, he cried, you have killed my love. You used to stir my imagination. Now you don't even stir my curiosity. You simply produce no effect. I loved you because you were marvelous, because you had genius and intellect, because you realized the dreams of great poets and gave shape and substance to the shadows of art. You have thrown it all away. You are shallow and stupid. My God, how mad I was to love you. what is seen. You can see how mean he is there. And he's starting to change. So, completely disgusted, Dorian calls it off with Sybil. And there is a picture in here to illustrate this scene on page 146. You can see Sybil down on her knees there and she's clutching on to Dorian. She crouched on the floor like a wounded thing, it says here. This is a quote. And Dorian Gray, with his beautiful eyes, looked down at her. This is from the Picture of Dorian Gray, that one, Majeska, published in 1930. These are all different editions that I'm showing from this book. So, it's quite sad. Dorian returns home and he notices that something about his painted portrait has changed. So that is on page 87. Okay. It says here, in the dim, arrested light that struggled through the cream-colored silk blinds, the face appeared to be a little changed. The expression looked different. One would have said that there was a touch of cruelty in the mouth. It was certainly strange. So Dorian notices that the portrait, his painting, has changed and it looks cruel. Let's carry from here. But the strange expression that he had noticed in the face of the portrait seemed to linger there, to be more intensified even. The quivering, ardent sunlight showed him the lines of cruelty around the mouth, as clearly as if he had been looking into the mirror after he had done some dreadful thing. So Dorian reflects on the painting and the events of the evening, and his conscience and sense of guilt lead him to rethink what he did and said to Sybil. He then hides the portrait from his view and goes to bed with the intention of smoothing things over with Sybil in the morning. So in chapter 8, when Dorian wakes the next day, he checks the painting and finds that it is indeed changed. And the expression on the face is even crueler. Lord Henry arrives and shares the bad news that Sybil has died overnight. And all this is happening in chapter 8 now. And on page 157 here, there is an illustration of the scene. This is Lord Henry sharing the terrible news. Dead, Sybil, dead. It's not true. It is not true. And this is from the Picture of Dorian Gray, Volume 2 of the Sunflower edition of the works of Oscar Wilde, 1909. So, Lord Henry then tries to persuade Dorian to avoid any sense of guilt and instead try to see Sybil's death as a symbolic and artistic expression of love. Dorian is persuaded once again by Lord Henry and agrees to meet him at the opera that night. Lord Henry then leaves, and influenced by his ideas on art above all else, Dorian reflects on Sybil, deciding to remember her as a wonderful, tragic figure, as if to romanticize her death and any part he played in it, to avoid guilt, and that he was set for a life of pleasure and indulgence. And he didn't want to let anything get in the way of this life plan for indulgence and pleasure. So we can see here something important that I wanted to read. He felt, this is Dorian, he felt that the time had really come to make his choice, or had his choice already been made. Yes, life had decided that for him, life and his own infinite curiosity about life. Life had decided that for him. Eternal youth, infinite passion, pleasures, subtle and secret, wild joys, and wilder sins. He was to have all these things. The portrait was to bear the burden of his shame. That was all. So he then covers up the portrait. He doesn't want to look at the changes that he's seeing, the cruelty around the mouth. So he covers it up. And then in chapter 9, Basil visits Dorian, offers condolences, while Dorian shrugs them off easily, explaining that he and Lord Henry prefer to see Sybil now as elevated to the sphere of art. Basil is shocked by Dorian and the influence Lord Henry's had on him. Basil's upset that a screen is hiding the portrait and asks to have it removed so that he can look at it, because he now wants to exhibit it. Dorian refuses to show him and says it must never, ever be exhibited, and that the artist can never look at it again. After Basil leaves, Dorian hides the portrait. And then we get to chapter 10. So in this chapter, Dorian employs some men to move the portrait to an unused room on an upper floor of his house to keep it locked away so that no one can witness its changes. Dorian then sits down to read, and there's a newspaper and also a yellow book sent by Lord Henry. He glances at the newspaper and notices the death report of Sybil, and shocked by what he calls the ugliness of the reality of it. He then distracts himself with the yellow book, a story that blurs the lines between virtues and vice through its pleasure-seeking protagonist. So that yellow book begins to have influence over Dorian Gray as well as Lord Henry's ideals and philosophies. So in chapter 11, Dorian becomes fixated on the yellow book, and years pass. He immerses himself in the pursuit of beauty, in beautiful arts, and in music and perfumes and tapestries. People spread rumors, picking up that he's engaged in dark and scandalous activities and preoccupations, while others say they don't believe the rumors since he has such a pure and innocent appearance. Dorian revels in the fact that his body never ages, while the portrait ages and deteriorates. Sometimes he's horrified when he views his portrait, and other times he expresses relief that while the corruption of his soul is revealed in the painting, his body is spared and he remains beautiful and youthful looking. And that is mostly what happens in chapter 11. As I said, many years pass. And so now in chapter 12, while walking home from Lord Henry's around 11 p.m. on the eve of his 38th birthday, so you can see that he really has aged some years, Dorian notices a man in the fog, and he realizes it's Basil, but tries to avoid him. However, when Basil notices Dorian, he calls out and follows him home. Basil comments on the horrible rumors circulating about Basil's behaviors, his terrible influence on those around him, and that he should instead use his influence to affect people in positive ways rather than negative, destructive ways. Basil expresses that he feels he doesn't know Dorian at all anymore, and that he wishes he could see his soul. And Dorian responds by laughing and saying that he will indeed show Basil his soul. So this is getting quite scary now. I'll read from here. A bitter laugh of mockery broke from the lips of the younger man. "You shall see it yourself. Tonight," he cried, seizing a lamp from the table. "Come, it is your own handiwork. Why shouldn't you look at it? You can tell the world all about it afterwards if you choose. Nobody would believe you." Dorian Gray smiled. There was a curl of contempt in his lips. "Come upstairs, Basil," he said quietly. "I keep a diary of my life from day to day, and it never leaves the room in which it was written. I shall show it to you if you come with me." So he's been keeping the portrait hidden away upstairs, and now he's inviting Dorian. Dorian's inviting Basil upstairs to come take a look at it. And I have here an illustration of that scene. It's 218. It's here. Come upstairs, Basil. And this is from the Sunflower edition, 1909. So Dorian leads Basil up to the room where the artwork is locked away. He removes the curtain to show Basil the portrait that is now absolutely hideous. Basil is appalled and tells Dorian to beg for forgiveness and that the painting should be seen as an awful lesson. This is in chapter 13. So he's urging Dorian to look at this painting as a lesson, an awful lesson, but Dorian looks at Basil with hatred, seizes a knife, and stabs Basil several times. Just an illustration here from the scene. That's quite scary. He then locks the room. Basil, that is, after he's stabbed. Dorian locks the room after he's stabbed Basil, and he hides Basil's things and steps outside for a moment and re-enters the home, being sure to wake up a servant to make it seem like he's been out all night. And I think, right here, he says, "I'm sorry to have to wake you up, Francis, but I had forgotten my latchkey. What time is it?" 2:10, sir. So you can see this is the scene where he's making it seem like he was out. He woke up the servant, and now the servant will think that he has nothing to do with the murder. So in chapter 14, Dorian wakes the next day and is still filled with a hatred for Basil. He has his servant call an old friend. With whom Dorian has had a close, intimate relationship. The friend, who is a scientist, arrives after hearing it's an urgent matter. Dorian asks the scientist friend to use his knowledge of chemistry to get rid of the body, threatening that he will expose a secret about the scientist. So Dorian leads the scientist up to the room. And so the painting has changed once again to reveal the horrors and corruption of Dorian. It says here, Dorian half opened the door. As he did so, he saw the face of his portrait leering in the sunlight. On the floor in front of it, the torn curtain was lying. He remembered that night before he had forgotten for the first time in his life to hide the fatal canvas, and was about to rush forward when he drew back with a shudder. What was that loathsome red dew that gleamed wet and glistening on one of the hands, and though the canvas had sweated, as though the canvas had sweated blood how horrible it was. So, the painting has changed again, revealing the horrors and corruption of Dorian. The scientist then completes his work, and later Dorian goes up to see that the body of Basil is no longer there, but a horrible smell of nitric acid remains. So in chapter 15, in the evening, Dorian attends a dinner party, is unable to eat, and Lord Henry notices. When Lord Henry nonchalantly asks what Dorian did the night before, Dorian reveals again that he's on edge when he replies defensively. Dorian leaves early, goes home and burns Basil's belongings. And he then pulls a canister of opium from a cabinet and heads out around midnight. So in chapter 16, he goes out to the opium dens, and Dorian reflects that since his bad deeds are unforgivable, he will try to forget about them. And he sees a young man there named Adrian Singleton, who is rumored to have been corrupted by Dorian. He leaves the den and is unknowingly followed out by a sailor. And while Dorian is contemplating his bad influence on Adrian, he is suddenly seized from behind and held at gunpoint. It is James Vane, Sybil's brother. He accuses Dorian of involvement in his sister's death. Dorian says that was several years ago, so he should be looking for a much older man, using his very youthful appearance as evidence that it couldn't possibly be him. So James releases Dorian, goes back to the opium den, where he learns that the man he just held at gunpoint has been coming to the den for 18 years and has never aged. So James, realizing he let Dorian get away, decides that he will hunt Dorian down. And in chapter 17, at a party at Dorian's home a week later, when Dorian leaves the room for a moment, he's heard moaning, and guests find that he has fainted. Though disoriented, he stabilizes and returns to have a dinner with his guests, where he's haunted by the memory of a face, the face of James Vane at the window. So we're getting into the final chapters here. Chapter 18. So for days afterward, Dorian's conscience haunts him with the image of James Vane. He tries to get out and distract himself. He tags along a group of men who are out shooting for sport, and when they are about to aim for a hare, he begs them not to shoot it as he becomes mesmerized by its beauty. They go ahead and take aim, but end up shooting a man off in the distance, and Dorian sees this as a bad omen. Lord Henry later asks Dorian about his interest in a duchess, and Dorian admits that he thinks he's unable to love as he's too interested in himself. And a little later, Dorian's taken to go look at the identity of the man shot earlier, and it turns out to be James Vane. And Dorian is relieved. And so some weeks later, we're into chapter 19 now. Some weeks later, Dorian tells Lord Henry that he wants to change and become virtuous, claiming that he recently decided not to seduce or take advantage of a young woman. He tells Lord Henry not to give the yellow book to anyone else as it has corrupted him. Lord Henry says that no book or art should have this power. And then in the final chapter, chapter 20, Dorian goes to view his portrait in hopes of seeing an improvement in it, and he believes that his recent virtuous acts of leaving the young woman alone would be seen in the painting. Instead, it appears even worse. It says here, he could see no change save that in the eyes there was a look of cunning, and in the mouth the curved wrinkle of the hypocrite. The thing was still loathsome, more loathsome, if possible, than before. So Dorian then grabs a knife and stabs the portrait to destroy it. Servants hear a loud cry, and once broken into the room, they find this. When they entered, they found hanging upon the wall a splendid portrait of their master as they had last seen him, in all the wonder of his exquisite youth and beauty. Lying on the floor was a dead man in evening dress, with a knife in his heart. He was withered, wrinkled, and loathsome of visage. It was not till they had explained the rings, they had examined the rings, that they recognized who it was. So the portrait, after Dorian stopped the painting, the portrait returned to its original state, and Dorian himself was the one who lay dead and old. So in terms of themes of this novel, we have the main themes of the purpose of art, the purpose of art, and the value of beauty. The value of beauty. And we also have narcissism. And superficiality of society. And the negative power of influence, as seen in Lord Henry's influence over Dorian, along with the Yellow Book's negative influence over Dorian Gray. And some of the recurring motifs would be the portrait itself. The portrait. And we have, and which is constantly worsening and revealing Dorian's vices. And another important recurring motif is the romantic relationships between men. And the novel's main takeaway, as expressed through Oscar Wilde's own words, here. All excess, as well as all renunciation, brings its own punishment. This highlights a tension we see throughout the novel. A tension between morality and hedonism, between the ideals of Victorianism and those of artistic indulgence. So, how was it received? So, the reception of this novel, since the novel was a critique of the repressive nature of Victorianism, it was immediately controversial, and many readers were offended by its content, while others enjoyed and appreciated it. It became a classic. It's a favorite novel of so many readers today, as its themes still resonate more than ever. The novel has been adapted into films and novel retellings. There was one directed by Oliver Parker in 2009, and then there was one 1945 was, I believe, one of the first. I can show you a picture of that right here. There's a new Netflix series coming out. I believe 2024, if not 2025. Coming soon, in any case. So I hope you enjoyed this soft study of the novel Picture of Dorian Gray. Until next time, please take good care of yourself.